Okay, good evening. I'm back for our fifth live broadcast here on Thinking Like a Geographer. This is our Industry and Economic Development Unit review. Next week will be Urbanization. That will be our last content unit review. Stay tuned, though. We may decide to add a review of just some general content as the test gets a little closer. So may do that, may not. Just kind of see what's going on between now and then. So a couple of things to get started. One is remember to add questions to the board. Also remember that we have you have the opportunity to do some peer review, peer editing, practicing those essays, things like that. So let's get started today. Once again, this is the Industry and Economic Development unit, and a couple of things to keep in mind is that these two concepts of industry and economic development are linked together in the fact that as countries develop, they usually do so based on their ability to develop industry. So countries that remain primarily based on primary type activities do not see much economic growth. However, those who are able to move into the secondary type of industries have more potential for growth. And so when we link these two things together, it's because there is a perceived cause and effect relationship, or at least some believe that's the case. However, we'll look at some examples and theories today that support the idea of that and support some contrary theories as well. So, well, let's get started by looking at some questions that were posed. Once again, Christina has posed some questions for us, and thank you, Christina, for your questions. And we have two questions from Christina today. The first one says, how do Mexican maquiladoras and China's special economic zones work? And this is actually, there's some different types of factors at play here. Part of this is part of the process of deindustrialization. So as countries move into what we call MDCs, or become most developed countries, become core countries within the core periphery model, one of the things that tends to happen is they tend to move away from secondary type industries and into tertiary, quaternary, quinary type industries. When this happens, their industrial base or their secondary industries are moved other places because it simply becomes too expensive to provide for those for the value. And so a lot of times this leads to either inter-regional shifts, like we see in the United States, from manufacturing from the upper Midwest to the South and the West, or we see offshoring or outsourcing, where countries move, or where companies move their manufacturing from core to periphery. And that's kind of what's happening in both of these cases, is we see the movement of secondary type industries and manufacturing from a core region to a developing periphery region. So, for example, in the case of the maquiladoras, that's happening in northern Mexico, and basically the reason why it's happening there is twofold. One is location. For the case of the maquiladoras, they're right there, right across the border. So you get the benefit of being in a different country with cheaper labor costs, with cheaper kind of production costs, but you don't have to pay the additional money of having to transport it over a much further distance. You can move just across the border and save that money. But one of the ways that these companies or these regions attract these different businesses is through things like tax breaks and things like that. So they may say, hey, X and Y-Z company, come move here, and for 20 years you won't pay any taxes here. And so obviously that's a big economic benefit to those companies. They save a lot of money, and so those companies are willing to move there. So the maquiladoras have developed there in response to this idea of deindustrialization, and because they have created these areas that are beneficial to the company in other ways. Obviously, from a business perspective, this is good because you're saving money. You have less upfront costs or production costs, so you theoretically could charge less for your products. The downside of this is that the periphery region, in this case with the maquiladoras, we're talking about northern Mexico, um, do not get tax revenue from these companies and from these industries, that tax revenue that could be used to do all kinds of different things within the country, such as develop infrastructure, develop domestic industries, things like that. It does provide jobs, but they're obviously low-wage jobs as opposed to jobs and money that could be used to reinvest. And there's lots of debate about whether or not this is a good economic strategy for countries to be involved in. But at any rate, that is kind of the way it works in Mexico. And the special economic zones in China are similar. They do the same kind of thing. Obviously, transportation is not as big of a concern, or at least no one worries about it, probably because the scale is so much smaller in terms of everything is so much more made so much more cheaply there that it's possible for companies to absorb that transportation cost and still come out way ahead in the deal. So China has done this with these special economic zones, where they set up much easier pro-business, or lower taxation, lower fees, lower regulation types of industries in order to do this. So it's about saving money. It's about saving money on labor, saving money on resources, saving money on different types of things, such as regulations, such as a lot of times these countries will have significantly lower environmental standards, so things such as air quality and things like that are not as valued, and therefore the companies don't have to absorb the cost of those things, and so it allows them to produce goods cheaper. And of course, cheap goods is good if you want to buy stuff cheaply. And everyone likes to pay as little as possible for their products. However, the downside is that cheap goods also, have the drawback of that cost goes somewhere. It does not go away. It does not disappear. So that cost is passed on to the people in those local economies a lot of times. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of how that works, and we'll get into some more of those details development over time. Christina's other question deals with, let me see if I can find it here. Okay, why are most of a country's wealth or state development based on GNI rather than GNP or GDP? And that's a really good question. So there are lots of different measures. Economists look at lots of different things. They have lots of different calculations that they use, lots of different indexes, that are often used. GDP and GNP are kind of the two of the more traditional ways to do that. So GNP stands for gross national product, which means the values of all goods and services produced by a country's citizens, regardless of where they are. So if I'm working in another country and I send money, and the money that I earn counts toward my home country's GNP. GDP is gross domestic product, which counts just what is produced within a country's borders. So they're all measuring different things, and depending on what you're looking at, most of these measures are accurate and useful in some ways. In very broad general senses, because we're looking at things on the macro level, the large level, the big scale, then we tend to look at these gross, large numbers. GNI is a relatively new measurement relative to GDP and GNP, and I don't know that there's necessarily any the one is necessarily better than the other. I know GDP is kind of not as popular as GNP for a long time. But my understanding of GNI, and once again, some of these measurements are quite complicated, but GNI includes some things that are kind of important, especially to core countries or more developed countries. Things like investment, things like interest payments that come from money that is loaned and things like that, or the net of that, positive or negative net of that, is often included in GNI. Things that aren't included in GDP and GNP, so it's not how many cars you sold or how many bushels of wheat you sold or those kinds of things, but it also includes these big global international finance measures as well that that more developed countries and core countries are heavily involved in which a significant amount of their income comes from. So that actually gives us an interesting measure. One of the things that I think is interesting about this measure is it allows us to kind of analyze all countries through a developed country lens. And the benefit to that is it allows us to see, especially in a world in which countries are growing economically, especially in the secondary sector, it allows us to see how countries relate to the core. So if we're using a measure that defines the core very strongly, such as GNI, because of those interest payments and those kinds of things, then it really helps us get an idea of where other countries stand. So we can look at the GNI of the United States and compare that to the UK, and we can see how they are relative. And we can see, well, you know, they're relatively similar and relatively close together. If we take the GNI of the UK and compare it to Bangladesh, then we would see probably a big gap there between those two, because Bangladesh is underdeveloped and does not have those tertiary, quaternary, quinary industries that produce those measures that really make GNI relevant. So what that tells us then is that if we are Bangladesh and we are trying to advance and we're trying to become part of the global core, it tells us where we are in that process and what those differences kind of are. So that's kind of, I think, why it has become popular to use GNI, because it helps establish some kind of basis for comparison based on where everybody thinks they want to go, in terms of being like the core. So that's why GNI has kind of become more popular in recent years. But once again, that's kind of a fad now, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but there may be a new measure in a few years, and then that measure may become popular again. But once again, all those measures are relevant and significant in some ways. So it's really more about how you use it and the appropriateness of its use relative to the situation than any kind of absolute. But yes, you are correct that GNI has kind of become kind of trendy recently. So, all right. So thank you very much for that, Christina. And but that's the end of our questions today. So one of the struggles with this unit is there's a lot of models. I wouldn't say there's a lot of models, but there's some models, and they're really visual the way that they're laid out. I don't really have access to a lot of visuals here because I just have not been able to figure out the file share, the screen share on Google yet. So still working that out. So let me kind of run down some big concepts that you'll want to remember. I'll explain some of them. Some of them, I'll just leave it to you. As usual, remember that you really want to focus on your vocabulary, making sure you get that. So a couple of models that you'll want to keep in mind. One is the hoteling model of industrial location. One of the famous example of the ice cream vendors on the beach, and where do they locate relative to where customers are. And that's the thing to remember about industrial location models, is it's where do we locate and what do we locate relative to. what factors do we consider? So Hotelling is looking at interdependence. Where is a company going to set up their firm relative to other similar types of firms? Is it advantageous to be close or further away from those firms? The other big important model is Weber. Alfred Weber's model of industrial location is looking at the location of resources, the location of markets, and considering transportation costs and perishability as part of his determinant. So the idea that, excuse me, we want to be close to a market based on some factors and close to the resources based on others. And there was also including things like weight, bulk gaining and bulk losing processes. So if you are a bulk gaining process, you are going to be more often located near a market. If you are a bulk losing process, you're going to be located closer to the resource, so that you're transporting the heaviest part of the load the shortest distance, because when we're talking about shipping and transportation costs, it's most often based on weight. So those are some models to remember. So wanted to get a little bit into some theories of economic development. Sorry, I'm having some trouble talking today. It's been a very long semester for me. So, for example, there are kind of our two schools of thought on economic development. One school is what we call the liberalist school, liberalist models. And the one that is most famous and most popular, and the one that you'll want to know, is Rostow, R-O-S-T-O-W. Rostow, as all liberals do, have this idea that all countries, places can develop, that there's a uniform path to development, that every country is on the same path to development. They're at different places and moving at different rates. So, for example, the United States and the UK are at one end of the model, and they're in the fifth stage, the high consumption stage, while a country like India is kind of in the middle somewhere. A place like Bangladesh is toward the bottom. But they're all slowly or rapidly, depending on what's going on, moving toward the end goal, which is that high mass consumption and full development stage. One of my students today actually asked me if we take Rostow's model to be true, and eventually everyone develops and becomes wealthy, well, what happens then? And it was an interesting question, because I didn't really have an answer to it. Because the answer is, I don't know. I guess I don't know. I don't know if Rostow ever imagined a situation where countries might actually start going backwards, or where some countries may continue to additional stages that he had not necessarily conceived of. But I do think it's an interesting thought. So, but anyway, the idea of Rostow being that everybody can improve, everybody can move forward. So countries like China, Brazil, and India that have really been booming the last couple of decades in terms of their economic development, Rostow would point to those and say, hey, look, anybody can do this, anybody can improve. There are some serious criticisms to Rostow. There are lots of people that say, well, those are great examples, but those examples have some advantages. You've got India has a large population. They have a really good infrastructure left over from the era of imperialism. Slight side note here, while imperialism is bad, if you have to be taken over by an imperialist power, pray it is the British. You do not want the French or the Dutch or the Germans or anybody else. The British will at least leave you with something usable, as is the case in India. Anyway, they left an infrastructure behind. So critics of Rostow would say, yes, India developed because somebody else paid for the infrastructure. Somebody else paid for those preconditions to take off to exist in order to allow that infrastructure to happen. People point to China and say, look at this, they're really booming. Well, yes and no. They're booming in terms of the amount of economic activity, and part of that is due to just their immense population, but they're also really kind of pigeonholed into one particular type of economic activity, which is low-skilled manufacturing. And so there's lots of theories that argue that you cannot build a strong economy on low-skilled, low-wage labor, which is exactly what China is trying to do. So you could say yes, they definitely have improved. They're industrializing, they're urbanizing at a very rapid rate, but there is that sustainable, and will that really lead to them moving further along, or will they eventually kind of reach the most potential they can get out of that? And so the other thing, India also has a really good educational infrastructure for some people, but at least they do have a lot of skilled technical labor there as well. And so anyway, so some people point to this kind of uneven distribution of resources, of infrastructure, of access to capital and things like that allow these countries, some countries, to develop much more rapidly than others. And Rostow would not necessarily argue with that. He wouldn't necessarily say that was a problem. He would just say that that those other countries that don't have those things are just moving much more slowly. So that's kind of the idea of the liberalist model, the idea that we're all going to be better off one day. The other interesting model, and this is kind of my bias, I personally believe in Model 2, which is what are called structuralist models. This is where I come from personally. Structuralist models argue that the system is built and designed for some to be core countries, some to be periphery countries, and the system is designed not to change, or to be very resistant to change. So it's not easy for countries to change, if at all possible. And the reason why it doesn't work this way is that the core countries manipulate the economic system, the political system, in order to keep those countries dependent. And the reason why they do that is that they need access to cheap resources, to cheap labor, to markets for their goods. And in order to do this, they have to manipulate these structures. Some interesting ways to think about this. There's kind of two kind of sub-theories or parts that are dominant within the structuralist camp. One is dependency theory. Dependency theory kind of argues that core countries need periphery countries. They need them. They need them to provide resources and things like that, and so they will do this manipulation. For example, you could look at a place like the Dominican Republic, and you could say, well, the United States is the largest trading partner of the Dominican Republic. They import 80% of Dominican imports go to the U.S., which is not uncommon. A lot of Latin American countries have similar types of relationships with the U.S., and most countries will have dominant relationships with their neighboring countries. The difference is that between the U.S. and the Dominican Republic, there's a significant power disadvantage. The U.S. being a core country, the Dominican being a periphery country. So a structuralist would argue that this 80% of trade is much more important to the Dominicans than it is to the United States. So the U.S. could very easily turn around and say, okay, Dominica, we no longer need to buy bananas from you. We're going to buy them from somebody else. And that decision, that choice, has a much bigger negative impact on the Dominican than it does on the U.S. And so the U.S. has the flexibility to change its trading partners, to change some of these relationships and things like that, where the Dominican desperately needs this relationship with the United States because of the sheer volume of trade that comes in and out of it. Therefore, the Dominican is dependent on the U.S., while the U.S. is not dependent upon the Dominican. The idea being that these countries all produce things that can be easily replaced in the market. So bananas or coffee or coconuts or whatever it be, we can easily find another trading partner, where it's much harder for you as a developing country to find someone that will buy 80% of your products. So what does that mean? What that means is that when trade agreements expire and they're renegotiated, the power of that renegotiation lies in the core. Now, this is not to say that the United States or core countries are cruel or horrible and things like that. They may or may not be. It just means that they have the power to dictate the terms. And as any country would do, they're likely to create terms that give an advantage to themselves. So because the U.S. has the power to do that, they're more likely to do that. Let's say, for example, the U.S. is negotiating with the Dominican about the sale of bananas. And the Dominican says, well, we really want to pay, we really want you to pay us more for our bananas than what you want to pay us. You want to pay us, $3 a pound for bananas, and we want you to pay us $5 a pound, so that we are earning more money. The U.S. is in a position to say, well, we can have fewer bananas, and we cannot get them from the Dominican and have fewer bananas. That's an option. People won't be happy with that, but they'll be okay. Or they could say, we could just get our bananas from Cuba, or we'll get them from the Bahamas, or we'll get them from Barbados, or insert country here. So in these negotiations, the power lies squarely with the core and the periphery. You also see this in post-colonial relationships. So if you go look at the periphery countries that were once colonies, you'll still see a very close economic tie to those core countries. So if you look at West Africa, you'll still see a very strong tie between those countries and France. So France has, as a core country, has the power to kind of manipulate those relationships. Same thing with West Africa and the British. Same thing with some different parts of the world with Spain and some things like that. So those relationships still exist, and they're kind of legacies of colonialism. So even though these countries are independent, even though they've technically broken away from these countries, the infrastructure and the trade relationships lead to the maintenance of this dependency, right? So that's dependency theory, which once again is a structuralist model. Another structuralist model is called Wallerstein's world systems theory. And world systems theory kind of talks about the idea, it introduces the idea of what we call a hegemonic power. And a hegemon is a particular country or region that has overwhelming political and economic power on a global scale, and that they are in a position to dictate, control, manipulate the global economic arrangements to their benefit. And you can look back through history and you can see some of these. So if you look at the 15th and early 16th century, you can point to the Dutch as being kind of this global hegemonic power. If you look at the 16th through the 19th century, you could see the emergence of other Western European powers, especially the British. If you go further back to the time of exploration, when the Spanish are dominant, okay, so these different Western European countries at different times kind of had this role as hegemonic power, and it had the compounding effect of keeping all of that power and wealth concentrated into one particular region. So you could look at at the ability over time and historically for Western Europe to kind of control and dictate the global terms and arrangements. 20th century, you could look at the United States as being that global economic power. As we move into the 21st century, I think some would argue that the power of the United States is beginning to decline a little bit. Some point to China as the next hegemonic power. Don't personally see that happening, but simply because their economy is so dependent upon
once again, those low-skilled, low-wage jobs in manufacturing, and not some of the larger global finance types of things. Two kind of interesting case studies on this. If you're interested, one of them you're probably familiar with. Your teacher's probably presented this to you. Is the idea of The World is Flat, which is a book by Thomas Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, in which he talks about globalization from a very liberalist perspective. The idea of looking at certain parts of the world and the way that they've developed and the pace at which they're developing and how technology speeds that process up. Another interesting, I think, counter argument to that is if you look at Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, where he argues that it's really the geography that determines puts severe constraints on those societies, and so somewhere in between those two arguments, your liberalist, possibilist model of freedom and your structuralist, determinist Jared Diamond argument, somewhere in between is a book by Harm de Blay. Now, Harm de Blay is the author of a human geo textbook that many of you probably use. So that's the one that our district uses. And his book is called The Power Place, and it's it seeks to explain how both of these arguments can work. But basically, his argument is not that the world is flat, but the world is spiky. That there are places of extreme benefit and extremely rapid growth and development, and there are places of extreme poverty and extreme underdevelopment as well. Okay, those are kind of the two big development theories and how those things work. It's really interesting to think about them in terms of this core-periphery model, and the idea that the core exists and the periphery exists to serve the core. But it's also interesting to think about how a lot of times there's this middle group called the semi-periphery that sometimes serves as a periphery and sometimes serves as a core. So those countries we mentioned earlier, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, the Mexicos of the world are kind of semi-periphery because relative to the core, they're periphery. So relative to the U.S. and Western Europe, those countries would be serving a peripheral purpose. But they also have countries to which they act as a core as well. So Brazil acts as a core to Bolivia or Venezuela or places like that. China might serve that role for Southeast Asia. India might serve that role for Central Asia. So this idea that there's also this kind of this middle area, this middle ground, where there's economic development. This core periphery model kind of has a little more nuance to it. So. Okay, a couple more concepts that I want to toss out there just real quickly before our time is up. We're not going to go the whole 45 minutes today. We just don't have that much to chat about because this is some abstract stuff, but just really want to make sure that you have time to review that. One thing is the idea, and this is an idea that has been in several different FRQs, and that's the idea of agglomeration. Agglomeration is kind of the what's the word I want to use? Concentration, I guess, of economic what's the word I'm looking for? The concentration of similar types of economic activities together. There you go. For example, one of the ones that was on last year's test actually was about Silicon Valley and how that was an example of agglomeration. Basically, what agglomeration is there's some kind of a business that attracts other business. So Silicon Valley, you have the existence of a large, high-quality higher education networks, which attract technology firms. Technology firms attract investment capital and venture capitalists who want to start and invest in other technology firms. Technology firms attract other similar types of firms, so people that are intellectual property law or semiconductors, communications, software developers, all these kinds of things are all going to be kind of clustered together. And this, in some ways, this seems counterintuitive, because you would think you would want to not be too close to your rivals, because you're buying for the same market. The difference being, though, that it's those support services that make those businesses run are there, and it's easier and cheaper to use the ones that already exist than to try to create your own or develop your own. Now, then there's this process called degglomerization. Is that the word? Something like that. They were the opposite of agglomeration, which is when, for some reason, these agglomerations, these concentrations, begin to divide and split up, either because there is a new area that is underdeveloped but has a lot of growth potential, and so one firm or a few firms may move in order to take a comparative advantage and have less competition. Maybe the particular advantages of the original region have diminished to a point that it's no longer valuable. So some things like that. Maybe the costs are too high. This is the kind of thing that we see in the auto industry in the American Midwest, especially areas like Detroit, where you have this huge agglomeration of all the auto industry, both auto manufacturers, but also things like Goodyear Tire and Firestone and all these different companies that help provide support services, investment capitals, finance companies that help provide for these companies over time. And then as the manufacturing costs continued to climb and continued to get higher and higher, and these companies began to divest and move to places where it was cheaper, not just overseas, but, for example, moving from Detroit to Birmingham, Alabama, or Atlanta, or Baton Rouge, or someplace in the South, or Phoenix in the West, where you had lots of cheap land, where you had much lower labor costs, one, because of unionization, and two, just because of the economic realities of the region. All of a sudden, these companies move, and this is an example of this degglomerization. I cannot talk today. And so, obviously the tire companies are not going to stay in Detroit because the cars aren't there, and the people that make brake pads are not going to stay there, like Callahan Auto Parts, are not going to stay there because there's no business for them there. So they're going to move too. So this leads to agglomeration. So. And that's an important concept. As I said, it's kind of happened over time. And then the challenge then becomes for those communities to kind of repurpose and redevelop areas economically to support the population. As those companies leave, jobs go away, and people have to find new jobs. And so it becomes a huge effort to try to reuse those spaces. There's an interesting sample FRQ on the MOOC that talks about a former auto parts plant in some place that is now a call center, and it talks about the benefits of those call centers and things like that. And talks about that deindustrialization, shifting of economic activities types things, which kind of ties us right back into the idea of economic development, that you can see how core and periphery countries, as they move along, as they develop, you see some of this shifting occur in terms of the percentage of workers or the percentage of GDP for different sectors of the economy, and those kinds of things. So the other interesting thing to think about is almost getting back to Christina's questions or from earlier. So imagine that you are a economic planner in Mexico, and you're inviting in all these companies to come settle and build plants in your country, with all these promises of tax breaks and things like that. What happens when those tax breaks expire? or what happens when when what you want to happen happens, and you begin to develop economically around these manufacturing jobs. All of a sudden, workers demand higher wages, they demand higher living conditions, people want more stuff, and all of a sudden now the cost of doing business has gone up for those companies. What happens then? It's the same reason why they moved to the maquiladores in the first place, was for the comparative advantage and the relatively low production costs. So what happens now is they are free to move someplace else and take their economic development with them. So some of these liberalist strategies, or some of these things that are happening, have some bigger implications to them beyond just the short-term economic development. So, okay, once again, I don't really have much more to talk about today. I answered the two questions that were posted. Talked a little bit about some of the more complex things, your Wallerstein, your I remember what I didn't look at yet. One of the really cool things in this unit that I like to talk about is, and I'm not going to do it here because it's really a visual thing. Really go back and look at Walter Christoller's central place theory. It's a fascinating theory. Fascinating idea. It talks about the distribution of different types of economic products and how that in some ways helps determine the spatial distribution of towns and cities and population centers. I think it's a fascinating connection between the urbanization unit and the economic development unit. So go back and look at that if you have not done so. Also, we talked a little bit about GNI, GDP, and GNP. You'll want to go back and look at other measures. Look at some of those ways that we measure economic growth and development. Understand things like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Understand the way that that countries get into trouble when they have to borrow money in order to build infrastructure. How international debt has kind of been crippling in many parts of the world. Another thing that's very interesting to me, because I personally am involved in it, is the idea of micro-lending and microcredit. And I don't know that this is a huge emphasis on the AP test itself or in the curriculum, but it is an interesting kind of way of looking at and contrasting these different elements of core and periphery, and how elements of scale can really impact and affect those things. So anyway, all right. Well, that's pretty much all I have. I'm going to let you go, and keep sending in your questions, and we will see you next week.